Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice, released in March of 2019, is, in my opinion, the best game in the Souls series. It is also the best game I've ever played in general, across all genres of gaming. I'm not really sure if this is a hot take or not, as most reviewers claim that Sekiro is a 9 out of 10, but when talking about the best Souls games, or even talking about the series in general, people tend to gloss over Sekiro and say it was just alright, without really explaining why. When searching for Sekiro video essay, or Sekiro analysis, or something like that on YouTube, there seems to be a significant decrease in the amount of videos and the amount of total video views when compared to when you search Dark Souls video essay, or any game in the series that isn't Sekiro. This is especially interesting to me because there seems to be an abundance of Sekiro videos on the platform, and Sekiro is in the middle of the series when it comes to total sales. So the question still remains, why does no one want to talk about the game in depth? In this video, I want to do just that. Talk about the different aspects of this game in excruciating detail so I can let you guys know what I think the game does really well and what it does not do so well. This game is absolutely stunning. It is arguably, and is in my opinion, the best looking game in the series, despite there being 2 new entries since Sekiro came out. In looking into the game for the first time before buying it, I heard somebody describe it for the first time as like playing Dark Souls, but now there's color. Each level or area is extremely distinct when it comes to its visuals, and it keeps the game from feeling bland or boring at any point. Each area has its own vibe to it, and because the graphics are so good, it can evoke certain emotions just by going to these beautiful areas for the first time. The Ashina Outskirts, Reservoir, and Castle probably feel the least unique out of all the areas in the game because of how similar they are, but they're all done so well. And especially with the sort of phases that these areas go through near the endgame that drastically change the gameplay and visuals. It really makes areas like Ashina Castle feel grand and important in the same way that Honor Londo felt the first time I played through it. All of the enemies in the game also have unique visual designs that enhance the gameplay. The Sunken Valley enemies especially interest me, as their clothes and overall design just contrast so well with the snowy atmosphere of the Sunken Valley. Even though it's probably my least favorite area in the whole game, the same can be said about the Ashina Depths and Mibu Village areas of the game, with the ghost enemies. I'll get into this part a little bit more during my boss and level design section, but every single boss in the game is also extremely visually compelling. So much to the point where sometimes I'll just stand there like an idiot during beautiful fire attacks from Ishin, lightning attacks from Genichiro, smoke from the Owl, and many, many more. I really could go on and on about the bright blues of Fountainhead Palace, the broken statues and the whole feel of the Sunken Passage, the dead monks at Senpu Temple, and in many ways the hub area makes you feel at home with just its visuals alone. But the point is that From Software have created absolutely stunning levels that make me feel amazing even though I've already played the game nearly 10 times. It's pretty well known by now that Sekiro's story deviates heavily from all of its predecessors, and it goes for a much more streamlined approach. In the other Souls games, their predecessor, and their 2 possible successors, the story is presented in an extremely ambiguous way. Unless you're literally taking notes in the story, reading and piecing together the item descriptions, something I never bothered to do, and separately piecing together the convoluted story from beginning to end, it's very likely that you can play all 6 of these games without a clue to anything that actually happened in them. It's not impossible to understand the story in Dark Souls, and many fans actually love this piecing together of sorts, but it's undeniable that Sekiro allows for anyone to watch all the cutscenes as a cinematic experience and fully understand everything that took place. While it is possible to piece together the opening 3 cutscenes, some item descriptions, and Oscar's words to a point that you understand the story by the time you get to Firelink Shrine, it's highly unlikely. And you most likely won't really be role-playing as your character, and oftentimes it can feel like you're just going through the motions of a video game, just trying to progress. In Sekiro, you're able to get into the headspace of your character from the opening cutscene. Another thing to note is that in Sekiro you have a very urgent and serious goal right from the start, and that is rescuing Kuro. In many modern-day open-world games, they'll present this extremely urgent, save your loved one plotline, but then they'll also spend so much time and expect you to interact with side quests like fishing, cooking, etc. In Sekiro, there aren't really many side quests in the first half of this game, and the main focus is on rescuing Kuro. This allows the developers to focus more on the actual main sections of the game, as opposed to dumping hours of work into boring side quests. It also makes the game a lot more fun to fully 100%. Sekiro is probably one of the easiest games to 100% in the series, and you can realistically get all the achievements just by naturally playing through the game a couple times and not even looking anything up. The thing I love about Sekiro's story the most, however, is how it implements a much more straightforward story compared to the other games in the series, but it still retains those extreme item description details, dialogue details, etc. It still has these extremely interesting characters and lore details when you really look into it, but Sekiro's story is still easy to understand from the start. What I've basically been trying to say is that you can do the absolute bare minimum. Only watch the cutscenes, don't read anything, don't talk to anyone, and you can still fully understand the story. But you can also do the same level of lore hunting in this game that you can do in the other ones. Also, the game doesn't really have any DLC content, but it does have a couple optional areas near the end. And once again, I'll talk about this more in the boss level design portion of the video, but if you realize who this boss really is, and then you get a certain ending where you replace his role in the world, it could actually bring a tear to your eye in a way that no other Souls game before it could. Overall, I will admit that the story is a pretty average one though, but I don't really think that matters when rating and reviewing a video game. When you review a video game like Dark Souls, it's still possible for you to rate it a 10 out of 10, even though I think most would probably agree that while the Dark Souls story is fun and interesting in some places, it's far and away from being one of the best stories you've ever seen. And I think that's okay in a video game. The way I look at it is, the story is just a little extra motivation and a way to increase the role-playing elements, apart from purely story games like The Last of Us, of course. If the game can have no story and just be meaningless fun, I don't think an average story that enhances the game in some places, while not really dragging it down in any meaningful way, can't really hurt the game's overall rating. Sekiro has a really interesting combat system. Sekiro's original combat system is really interesting, and once the game really clicks with you, it starts to become more of a rhythm game than anything else. For lack of a better term, you'll probably feel really cool while playing, if that makes sense. I remember hearing, again before about the game, that Miyazaki said in the interview that he was trying to recreate the feeling of swords clashing. And I think From Software succeeded in doing just that in an incredibly fast-paced and interesting way. I know some of you might think that what I'm about to say is a bit hyperbolic, but I really mean it, and I think it speaks to the quality of the product From Software was trying to deliver. Probably at least half of the top 10 best moments I've had while gaming have all been from Sekiro. Hold on, don't go straight to the comics explaining how Sekiro isn't that good and I'm overreacting, and just hear me out for a second. That feeling of struggling with an encounter and overcoming those great odds is the main appeal of the Souls series, and Miyazaki has even said himself that that's what he set out to create when he first made Demon Souls in 2009. I feel like no other game gets that the same way that Sekiro does. Spending hours on a boss and then finally getting it just clicks with you is like no other feeling in gaming. It all just flows so well. You jump into the boss arena, and instead of frantically dodging through all of their attacks and maybe punishing on the fourth attack where they stand still for 2 seconds, you get to feel the full mastery you've acquired over a boss right from the get-go. With the way the posture system works, it makes it so if you stay super aggressive, hit exactly when you can hit, deflect all attacks, pull off all material jump counters, you can pretty much just steamroll every boss in the game, and I don't mean that in a bad way. The best way I've seen someone describe it is being in a flow state, and it's so rare that a video game can deliver that on such a consistent basis. I don't really know where to start with this section, so I guess I'll start by stating that every single system in this game works so well, and they all work so well in conjunction with each other in a way that just makes you go, wow, when you see it all put together. It's actually amazing they were able to pull all of this off. I suppose I'll start with the Vitality system. Sekiro implements a 4 prayer beads mechanic. Every time you kill a boss or mini-boss, you receive 1 prayer bead, and every time you get 4 prayer beads, you can combine them into a prayer necklace. Each prayer necklace increases your health by 80 HP, 1/4 of the total base health you start with. Oftentimes I hear people, especially those game journalists, claiming that Sekiro is way too hard because the only way to increase your health is by killing bosses, as opposed to how it worked in Dark Souls, where you could just farm souls at any point in the game, and you could technically get to an endgame level after just a couple hours of farming in an early game area. I don't think this change was a bad thing, however, as it encourages you to explore the world and find the various mini-bosses scattered throughout the map. Let's use Ashina Castle as an example. There are 2 required bosses in this area, granting you 2 out of the 4 necessary prayer beads that would get you to the next health upgrade. Now, you can make the game harder on yourself and just go to the next area with limited health, or you could explore the area a bit more and stumble upon the 2 optional bosses of the area, 7 Spears of Ashina and one of the Lone Shadow Warriors. If you choose to do this, it will give yourself an advantage and you will be more prepared for the next area. But if you don't, you may think that the game is too hard and that it has an unfair health system. The memory system does this, but just on a lesser scale. In Sekiro, every time you kill a main boss, you get a memory, which when consumed in the Sculptor's Idol menu, can increase your attack power by 1. This is similar to the prayer bead system, but not really the same, because there are only 2 optional memory bosses, and they're placed right before the final boss. The final boss is often considered to be the hardest in the game, and while at this point I don't really think anything in this game is hard anymore because I'm such a pro gamer Chad, I would generally agree with this. I do, however, think that the difficulty of this boss is overblown because many people may not have known about the 2 optional memories and may have gone in under-leveled. This is just a theory though, as I don't have any proof of it, but either way, this is another way the game encourages you to explore the optional sections of the game and balances out its difficulty. Moving on, the skill trees and prosthetics tools are another pair of underrated and often overlooked mechanics of Sekiro. I've often heard game reviewers and game journalists just gloss over these mechanics without really saying anything negative or positive about them, kind of like what they do when reviewing the game as a whole for some reason. But I don't really think that's the case. I recently came across a video called More Games Need Endgame. I'll link this in the description for you all to go to watch it, but the basic premise of the video was that some games, he cited Hollow Knight as an example, make sure you have pretty much every ability by the endgame portion of the game, and allow you to use your maxed perked out character in the extended end portion of the game. This essentially makes you feel as overpowered as possible. Though I haven't finished Hollow Knight, I agree with the general idea of this video and understand what he was talking about. While you won't have every ability at your disposal by the end of the first new game cycle, and I'll talk about this a bit more in my replayability section, you will have 90% of the skill tree paths and 90% of the prosthetic unlocks. And I think that this was intended. Again, I'll talk about this later in a different section. After Fountainhead Palace, when you come back to Ashina Castle for the second time, you'll be extremely skilled, and alongside your OP abilities, it'll feel amazing to fight through all the upgraded enemies. Again, for lack of a better term, you just feel cool. Deflecting all the enemy's attacks while spitting out a blue fire blast followed up by 10 seconds of a blue-purple fire sword, followed up by your character screaming Ichimonji and hitting them with an overhead slash twice, followed by a superpowered version of the magic red sword special ability, followed by, you get it. He's probably dead already, but wait, that's followed by you getting all your health back and a special healing animation plays. And wait, that's followed by, now you really get it. All of these mechanics just work so well, and I'll get more into this part in the level design section as well, but when you're going to again fight the guy that whooped your buttocks the first time you fought him, followed by an extremely strong ninja mentor in his prime, you feel like a total cool dude? Again, I don't really know. When talking about Sekiro's level design, one thing that I will concede on is that it doesn't have the same level of interconnectivity that Dark Souls 1 has, but there are a few branching paths here and there, and in my opinion, it utilizes its more linear and straightforward structure better than games like Dark Souls 2 and 3 do. It doesn't have the same level of direct interconnectivity as Dark Souls 1 has, but it manages to reuse certain levels and assets in interesting ways, so the game doesn't feel bland or copy and pasted, and this is evident after the first couple hours of gameplay. The tutorial zone in this game works really well because it teaches you everything you'll be needing to know for your 30-hour journey, but it also manages to be a sweet but short level that I genuinely really enjoy coming back to each New Game Plus cycle. Even as a new player, you should easily stomp on all of these guys in a way that feels fun. A lot of it has to do with the enemy placement, but the first time I really went through the series, the first time I really fell in love with this game. Something about doing your first death blow, getting the 1-2-3 combo and then the BAM death blow, and fighting your first boss in this game just feels extremely satisfying, and most of this has to do with how well done the art, animations, and sounds are in this game. I never get tired of seeing the same death blow animations over and over again, and I'm always excited about getting a death blow from the air, even though I probably have hundreds of hours in the game by now. For some reason, I just don't get the same fatigue from doing the same PvE trading of animation like I got from games like Elden Ring and Dark Souls 2. Since we're talking about game fatigue and replayability, I just wanted to say that I don't really agree with some of the negative attention this game gets when it comes to its lack of a replayability factor. I get that the main thing people are talking about when they complain about the lack of replayability is a lack of build variety. This hadn't really bothered me, and in other Dark Souls games, I find that just changing up my build, like using a magic build, just feels forced, and the gameplay doesn't really change. So I found that using a different build than what I originally wanted to maybe just feels like I'm going against my instincts and what I really wanted to do. So I kind of just stopped doing it. Nowadays, when I replay these games, I usually go into them with the same build and just try to do different things with the enemies, exploration, etc. Another big part of this is that for me, New Game Plus is a really big deal. And because there isn't enough lapis to get max prosthetics, not enough EXP to get max skill trees, and not enough memories to get max attack power, there is a significant reason to play New Game Plus in Sekiro besides trying out a new weapon, like it would be in the other games since soft caps are such a big deal. There is no stamina in Sekiro, and strangely that changes New Game Plus a lot. You can infinitely block and parry, and you'll find that you usually won't have to worry about your posture bar if your deflects are on point. So it's really fun to just jump into a boss battle in New Game Plus, stand still, and just perfectly deflect all of the enemy's attacks. In Sekiro, your character is objectively faster than any of the previous main characters in the series. Just running through an area and skipping enemies can be so much fun compared to the boring and overused boss runs in the other games. I will admit that Sekiro, basically being the only game that doesn't have boss runs, with its general idle placement and the new experience and coin loss system, does make me like running past enemies naturally more than I would if boss runs were still a feature. Moving on from replayability, I want to talk about the main levels of this game. I'm going to gloss over the main hub area of the game, the Dilapidated Temple, and I'll explain why in a little bit. Moving into the Ashina outskirts, this area serves as a sort of extended tutorial zone, with almost all of its bosses being ones that could realistically be the first boss of the game, and no one would bat an eye. Quick side note here, I'm noticing that Sekiro has a lot of the same features that Dark Souls 1 has, an extended tutorial area, a really good tutorial zone that you'll come back to later, and that's only in the first 2 zones of the game. My point here is that many will criticize Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3, Elden Ring, and Bloodborne for not having some of these features, but they won't really give Sekiro the credit it deserves. Back at the Ashina outskirts, you should find your first boss. I'm going to gloss over him for now and talk about him again when I talk about the chained ogre fight in a second. As you're exploring the area, you'll encounter your first merchant that will sell you coin purses. The game doesn't really communicate this to you, and you have to kind of figure it out by yourself, but the coin purses are a really good way to stash your money, and there seems to be exactly enough coin purses in the game for the total amount of coins you earn throughout the entire game. I don't really have any proof of this, but from my many playthroughs that's how it's tended to go. The coin purses, while simple in concept and design, are really helpful, and it sucks that a similar way of stashing your money isn't in any of the other Souls games. When I see a merchant, it's kind of like a checkpoint for my coins, in the same way a new skill point level is for EXP. Around this area, you'll also find an old lady that gives you the bell that will take you to the Harada Estate level. Taking the bell charm back to the Dilapidated Temple, you can access the Harada Estate level. While this level is completely optional, it's probably one that you should do, as it teaches you the fundamentals of the Makiri and jump counter with 2 separate bosses. Because of how this game allows you to realistically kill all the basic level enemies in a level like no other Souls game, with maybe a slight exception of Dark Souls 1, it increases the level of immersion. This system they have going where in the first couple hours of the game, you're expected to clear an area of all its enemies is present throughout literally every Souls game, every game in the series with no exceptions. but because it's already a couple hours into the game, Harada Estate is when the game really settles into the fact that you will be allowed to, and will be expected to, clear all the enemies within an area. This is obviously unlike many of the other Souls games, because in those games you will often have to run past enemies in most areas because they are designed to be too impossible to deal with. This is especially true in the most criticized of the Souls games, Dark Souls 2. The most interesting part about this level is how you'll be able to come back later and see different versions of events. Even at the end of the game, you don't really know which storyline is true, as different characters will tell you different things, and the game is a lot like the other Souls games in the way it conveys this level's story. While Lady Butterfly isn't particularly interesting to me as a boss fight, she was the first boss I ended up facing in Sekiro on my first playthrough. In a similar way to the Ashina Reservoir bosses I was talking about earlier, Harada Estate is kind of a special challenge that makes you better at the game and better prepares you to what will come after Oniwa at Ashina Castle. It is both optional and missable though, and it's up to you whether or not you want to embark on this challenge. Another interesting about Lady Butterfly is how there are about 10 snap seeds that can be found after the first encounter with a giant snake. Since snap seeds are most effective on Lady Butterfly, this really makes me theorize about when you were actually intended to fight her. Next up is the Chained Ogre boss fight. I usually don't see people saying that the Chained Ogre is the worst boss in the game, or anything like that, but he's definitely the boss that people critique the most. Even after proclaiming that Sekiro is the best game in the Souls series, and is the best game I've ever played, I feel like this is the hottest take I've stated so far. The usual reasoning behind the Chained Ogre backlash is that it's one of the only bosses in the game that requires you to deflect only about 50% of its attacks, while the other half are meant to be dodged. This is seen as an issue because it teaches you really early on that you should be dodging certain attacks with a dedicated dodge button, when this really isn't the case for literally 95% of the bosses in the game. In my opinion, this boss was meant as a Dark Souls tribute of sorts. There were already 2 bosses before this, and 1 boss after this that primarily has attacks that should be deflected. The Chained Ogre is, in my opinion, a harder boss for newcomers to the series, but it's something that experienced Souls players should be able to breeze past in a couple tries. I'm not saying that the Chained Ogre is perfect, however, and he does have a certain grab attack that I would say is a little unfair, and he isn't exactly the most spectacular boss in general. The next little section is a fairly noticeable spike in difficulty. You have to use what you've learned about stealth so far to a greater extent, and even then, you have to fight at least 2 enemies at the same time before the boss. The boss is pretty much an upgraded version of the general you fought before the heavy coin purse merchant. It doesn't do anything special, but it lets you know what the rest of the game is going to be like in terms of difficulty, and I see it as this game's get good area. It tells you that the game is going to be demanding, and after an extended tutorial area, this is where the game really starts. The first giant snake encounter isn't really that deep, but it's one of my favorite encounters throughout the whole game. It's pretty much just a gimmick fight, but when it's your first time going through the game, you somehow manage to escape into the small hut, the snake slowly approaches you, and right when it looks like you're gonna die, you see the opportunity to stab him in the eye. He then goes into a panic state, and while there wouldn't really be huge consequences when it comes to dying at this point, the snake is so well animated and it feels so real that your real life fight or flight instincts kick in. Your heart is genuinely racing as you try and escape the area. Since we're talking about the first snake encounter, I guess I'll just get the other 3 out of the way real quick, because I feel like they don't have any connection to their specific areas. The second encounter where you find him when the bridge crashes down and you have to swim through the water is honestly humiliating and just simply frustrating. The same can be said about the next encounter, and I honestly don't find the required puppeteer gimmicks to be all that interesting. I don't really find the puppeteer ninjutsu to be all that interesting in general. Since I haven't really talked about ninjutsus yet, I'll just say right here that this is honestly the only underdeveloped mechanic in the game for me. The one where the red smoke appears is so fun to pull off, but while I don't have a problem with spirit emblems in general, because I think it's a nice way to balance how many special attacks you can do, I do think all ninjutsus cost a little too much. Ninjutsus just feel rushed and lacking in general, and I feel like it would have worked a lot better if there were like 10 different ones that varied a lot from one another. Anyways, the way the second and third, and maybe even the first encounter with the snake feels so humiliating, it makes the ultimate triumph over him in the fourth encounter so awesome. Even though the struggles I had with the snake were entirely artificial, and is one of the only things that can in fact hurt replayability, the actual cutscene where you kill the snake and you get all bloody is always an extreme adrenaline rush, and that's always fun. Moving on from the snakes, we have the last part of the Ashina outskirts, the part that holds the Gyobu Oniwa boss fight. This section is pretty much just the standard Ashina area, but the lines of dialogue and characterization of the everyday soldiers is something that is really prevalent throughout this area, and it's something that kind of makes you feel bad and makes you want to help the dying soldiers during the second and third phases of the Ashina castle. The actual Oniwa boss fight itself isn't really anything to write home about. It's not bad or one of the worst fights in the game, so to speak, but it is kind of boring when comparing it to more challenging and overall more interesting boss fights like Genichiro, Ishin, or even the Divine Dragon. On your first attempt, however, he may take you a few tries and present a moderate challenge. What happens when you finally beat him almost makes it seem like they purposely made him kind of a mid-boss fight just for the sake of hyping up Genichiro. When you finally get a killing blow on this guy, an amazing animation plays at the end, where he says something along the lines of, forgive me, Genichiro." This simple line of dialogue actually accomplishes a lot. It lets us know that even while literally being killed, stabbed through the heart by us, Oniwa is begging Genichiro for forgiveness, almost like he's still scared of Genichiro even in death. This hypes up Genichiro and makes us dread fighting him, while also making us want to fight him even more. This also has intriguing, good story implications, as it insinuates that maybe Oniwa actually cares about Genichiro as a friend. Lastly, with the very emotional feeling and emotional tone, it lets us know that Genichiro actually cares about Kuro or Kuro's ability, Ashina, or both. Even though we're chasing after him, this gives us a slight moment of sympathy for Genichiro and increases the actual sympathy we feel when meeting him again and discovering his true purpose. This next section, typically referred to as Ashina Castle Entrance, is probably one of the areas I have the most distaste for in Sekiro. Probably the worst thing about this area is the required Ishin quest that you need to do in order to progress the game. The order of things is unusual, and it's very missable if it's your first time playing the game. It's kind of hard to tell what the requirements are, and even after doing it over 8 times, I don't really know which specific enemies you have to kill. The boss fight of this area, the Blazing Bull, is probably one of the worst in the game. It functions in the same way a poorly designed Dark Souls boss would, only this time you don't have iframes while rolling. With its janky hitboxes and trying to beat the bull without deflecting being extremely difficult, this fight can often come down to if you get lucky with positioning and hitboxes or not. The way the bull and the Ashina soldiers interact has always been interesting to me though, and killing those guards who open the gate for you is always fun. Past the Ashina Castle Gate is another unnecessary and boring boss fight. There's a general on the steps leading up to the main building, and alongside about 8 goons, he's guarding a divine grass that's inside of a chest. I'm not sure if this boss has the exact same movement as the second general you fight after the Chained Ogre, but it definitely does reuse a lot of assets, and it's one of the times this game misses when it comes to reuse content. Before heading to the main section of Ashina Castle, you may stumble upon a couple side levels. These were the optional bosses I was talking about earlier. The Spearman boss is generally regarded as one of the better bosses in the game, as he's extremely unique, and it's just an extremely enjoyable fight overall. The other boss is one of the Lone Shadow Warriors. This guy has a really interesting combat flow that allows you to take advantage of the counter systems in place, but the area creates some really annoying camera issues, and this can diminish enjoyment while fighting the boss. The main section of Ashina Castle is absolutely amazing though, and it is probably one of my favorite levels across all games in the series. The blue ninjas scattered throughout this area are super fun to fight, and they never really get old or annoying. The boss before Genichiro, the Jinzuke Sage if I'm pronouncing that right, can seem a bit unfair or restricted the first time you fight him. He only really does one attack, but it requires extremely fast reaction time, and if you can pull it off a couple times then you'll essentially be done with the fight. I used to not like this fight or the upgraded version of him you meet when you come back to Ashina Castle later, but if I do find myself struggling, I'll usually pull out a prosthetic, as most prosthetics tools work extremely well against this guy. Before we talk about Genichiro though, I think it's important to note that all of Senpu Temple, up until this last boss fight, a small portion of the Ashina Depths, and the first half of the Sunken Valley are accessible before this fight. This is great because it gives you a chance to grab a few more prayer beads and get a few more skills. I like that the game does this because if you find yourself struggling with Genichiro, you have about 5 other hours of content to play through to not only upgrade your character in the game, but also to improve your skills within the game in general. The first time I played Sekiro, I completely missed Genichiro, and I'm kinda glad that I did because the game didn't really click with me until I cleared the first portion of the Sunken Valley. Genichiro is a boss that you fight a total of 3 times throughout the game, and each time he has access to more and more abilities. At the start of the game, he'll probably completely overwhelm you, and this is intended as you aren't really supposed to beat him here. This second time you meet him, you will most likely struggle a lot, but even once he clicks with you, he'll probably still provide a challenge. Near the end, when you fight him at the same place you originally fought him, he's portrayed as weak, at least compared to you, even though he's in his final, most powerful form. This was obviously intentional from the development team because they wanted to point out how much better and stronger you were compared to the beginning, and I think that it worked. One thing I always hear people say is that you can't cheese your way through the Dark Souls games. If you beat Dark Souls, there's a certain level of respect that comes with it. I don't think this is true. In Dark Souls, there are so many ways to overcome your opponents using scummy tactics, and as someone who didn't really engage with anything like that during my playthroughs of any of these games, I didn't find Sekiro any harder than these past games. In Dark Souls, you can use magic, you can bait out a specific attack and punish, you can cheese, you can summon people who are better than you, and let them fight the boss for you. There is a reason people like the Let Me Solo Her Millennia guy are so popular. In Sekiro, it's extremely hard to kill enemies just off of pure damage, and the game kind of requires you to learn the skills and put in the effort to beat all of its bosses. I'm not saying that the people who use the tactics like summoning and those who cheese bosses are any less valid, and in some ways Sekiro can in fact be criticized for not being accessible to everybody, but if you played all these games blind and by yourself, which is how I think these games ought to and were designed to be played, then you most likely won't feel a major difficulty spike with Sekiro. After you defeat Genichiro, you get access to what I think is the full hub of the game. Kuro's Chamber is where you will often be going to progress in the game when it comes to healing upgrades and just overall progression, via talking to Kuro, talking to Emma, and picking up important items. The only reason you'll be consistently going to the Dilapidated Temple is to get prosthetic upgrades, but it's much more likely that you'll visit the Ashina Castle more often than the Dilapidated Temple, because Ashina Castle literally is the central hub that connects everything. Excluding Fountainhead Palace and the Harada Estate, you will be heading back to the specific idol when you'll eventually need to go to all other 8 areas in the game. Sunken Valley Passage, Ashina Reservoir, Senpu Temple, Mibi Village in the Ashina Depths, Ashina Outskirts, the Dilapidated Temple. They all literally revolve around Ashina Castle, with Kuro's Chamber being in the absolute center. After you pick up the Gun Fort Key, you can pretty much explore any remaining area in the game, with the exception of Fountainhead Palace, in any order you want. I would recommend that you go with Senpu Temple first, as once you complete Sunken Valley, Ashina Castle will turn into its endgame state, and you can't progress past the enemy village until you complete Ashina Castle's endgame phase. This suggested order is also the order I think the game wants you to take. Kuro first talks about the Mortal Blade, and since you serve Kuro, it would make sense to retrieve that first. Next, it makes sense that you explore Sunken Valley, because you again can't get past the end of the Ashina Depths yet. Kuro also only tells you to go down to the Ashina Depths after the second Ashina Castle phase. The elevator that takes you up to Senpu Temple was really cool, and after about 15 hours of gameplay, I really didn't expect to see any elevators in this game when I first played. Putting aside its mediocre boss fight and excluding the second and third phases that Ashina Castle goes through, Senpu Temple is easily my favorite level throughout all games in the series. Right when you get there, you are blown away by the amazing visuals, and the moment that you realize what really happened here is one of the most memorable experiences I've had while gaming. The Senpu Temple story reveal is on par with the Demon of Hatred twist. The game somehow manages to create a huge emotional connection between the player and these 2 NPCs you meet in Senpu Temple. Both characters have really sad sob stories, and if you follow their questlines to the end, you can end up helping them out a lot, and I'm glad the game took a brighter approach to these characters, opposed to the one they took with the sculptor, because the game would be really depressing overall if they didn't. and it's nice that they added some lighter elements in to a lighter game. All monk enemies in this area are extremely engaging and fun to fight, and I'm glad you get to learn some of their abilities via the skill tree. I don't really have anything unique to say about this area's different individual sections, besides that they're all beautiful and fun to play through. The folding screen monkeys, the final boss of this area, is a very controversial part of this game, and over time I've grown to like it less and less. I can see why some people did not like the boss. It's basically a puzzle boss. There are 4 monkeys in total, with each one having certain senses amplified and certain senses just not with them. I think most of this frustration that comes with this boss is the idea that it's tedious. Once you figure out where every monkey starts, you basically just have to catch up to them and interrupt its path. It can feel like you're going in circles in the map, and when you're an inch away but not able to catch it, you have to go through the entire motion again. This boss can have varying levels of difficulty based on how quickly you figure out the patterns. The invisible monkey is another issue. When I fought the monkeys for the first time, I already knew about the invisible one that follows you because I had seen other people talk about it, so it was actually the first one I killed. My friend, on the other hand, had a different experience. Let's call my friend Torbius. Torbius was an average Sekiro player. He finished the game in about 30 hours like most people and understood all of the game's mechanics. Torbius was set on playing the game blind. When he got to the folding screen monkeys, it took him about 15 to 20 minutes to get rid of the first 3 monkeys. This was during the time of the coronavirus, so Torbius was in a Zoom call for school. Because of this, Torbius was playing the game muted and couldn't hear the monkey. Torbius then spent the next 30 minutes trying to find the last monkey, and when he did, he didn't feel satisfied. What I'm trying to say is that this boss isn't your typical Souls boss, and it's even unusual for a puzzle boss in a way that feels cruel. Fighting them again on New Game Plus 1 feels fun, because you already know all of their possible paths, and evokes a happy revenge type feeling when you kill them all just after 1 or 2 minutes. The biggest problem with the folding screen monkeys, however, is that 99% of players will be bored of them by the time they get to their 6th playthrough. It's not an engaging fight, and at the end of the day, it's just a basic puzzle. If you fight them enough, you will eventually agree with my friend Torbius, and you'll probably find them very tedious. After you receive the Mortal Blade, you'll probably make your way down to the Sunken Valley. The Sunken Valley really uses the gun to sword combat really well. You'll have to either use some sort of prosthetic tools, or have extremely tight and accurate movements to avoid all gunfire. I think the positives mostly end when you go into the ravine though, and really just when you finish the Gunforce section, but since I've already talked about the second giant snake encounter, I won't talk about that again here. The monkey enemies are really unique, and I will admit they're fun to fight, but the way the fall damage works and just the platforming down to the Guardian Ape honestly sucks from a design perspective. Certain spots look like you should be able to grapple onto them, but you can't. This area is incredibly deep, but even if there is a grapple opportunity while falling down, the game won't allow you to fall more than a certain set amount before your screen goes black and your character is just reset to its original location. Also, I feel like the poison swamp doesn't really fit, even from a visual perspective. Whenever I imagine the idea of this level, but maybe around half the depth with a snowier rock floor instead of the poison swamp we got, I imagine a much better and less annoying level. The best part about this level is definitely the Guardian Ape though, as it's one of the best bosses in the game. The Guardian Ape seems extremely intimidating at first, and if you're still playing this game like a Dark Souls game, you're going to have a really hard time with this guy. This is kind of the final lesson of the game, and that's that you can literally counter or deflect anything in some way, even if it's a massive enemy. When this finally clicks, and you are literally deflecting Bigfoot punches, it feels amazing. The second phase is more of the same, and while I like the surprise, it doesn't really change anything about how I view the mechanics of the boss. By heading into the little mini cave that the original Guardian Ape was guarding, and picking up the white flower, you are starting the endgame portion of Sekiro. After this point, Ashina Castle will get invaded, and this along with Ashina Castle's third phase are probably the best levels in the game. Something about coming back to this massive Honorlando type area when it's in ruins and all the goons you were fighting against are desperately trying to protect their land is so compelling from both a story and gameplay perspective. I've seen a lot of people try to criticize the way you find out about this siege, but I think it's brilliant. You find out about it naturally and the game doesn't shove it down your throat. Nowhere does somebody you encounter tell you, "Quick, the castle is under attack, go back and save everybody." You choose to go back to Ashina Castle on your own volition after noticing that you've lost the ability to warp all of these previous areas. There are new bosses and enemies in every part of the Ashina Castle. Once again, the best section is the main building that has you fight the blue ninjas. This level gives you a great opportunity to use your red smoke ninjutsu, and taking down all of the enemies in the midst of fighting makes you feel like a total cool dude. I already talked a little bit about the upgraded blue ninja, but fighting him alongside an upgraded version of the chained ogre with your upgraded prosthetics and increased skill just feels so satisfying. Stomping the chained ogre with my upgraded flame vent and using my upgraded umbrella to shred through the Jinzuke Sage's posture bar is incredibly satisfying, and it's one of the game's biggest payoffs. Heading to the top, you are met by your father, and you are presented with a choice. You can essentially get a bad ending by siding with your father. This will give you the two final bosses, Emma the Gentle Blade and Ishin Ashina. It's absolutely incredible to me that From Software was able to make this right. By choosing this ending, you're basically not going to play through the final third of the game, and as somebody who chose the bad ending at first, I was amazed to find 5 more levels to explore after choosing a different option my second time through. Before we move on to the next levels though, let's first talk about the bad ending's bosses. Before I talk about their mechanics though, I just wanted to say that this ending from a story perspective is extremely tragic. Seeing Sekiro turn into Shura and seeing Emma, whose subtitle name literally has the word gentle in it, take out her sword on you to protect the person she thought you were the most loyal to the whole time is just so extremely sad. From a mechanical perspective, Emma is tough at first, but easy after you understand the flow of combat. She has a really annoying and long-reaching grab move though, similar to the one that the chained ogre had near the beginning. It goes the same way with the normal endings, but you first have to fight a weaker boss in Emma or Genichiro, and then move on to 2 of the strongest bosses in the game. Both versions of Ishin are very different in terms of story meaning and actual gameplay though. I'll talk about the other Ishin near the end of the video, but this Ishin is a diseased old man that was once your mentor on his last legs trying to defend the world from Shura. It's truly tragic, and I truly wanted to change my decision by this point on my first playthrough. Ishin is another boss that's hard at first, but easy once you understand all his difficult attacks. He has one of the widest movesets in the game, and that's obviously going to make the fight difficult to master. The hardest part about this fight is learning when he will and will not dodge your attacks. Also, you have to quickly memorize all flaming attacks because some of them can one-shot you. Overall, this is a fair but tough boss fight, and it's definitely one of the better ones throughout the game. I feel like this fight can oftentimes be underrated by some people because the second version of Ishin in the normal ending is usually considered to be the best boss in the game by most, and this is seen as kind of like a downgrade if that makes sense. A quick side note here, this kind of reminds me of Ornstein in Dark Souls 1 vs 2. In Dark Souls 1, he's a part of what is considered to be one of the best fights in the series, and in Dark Souls 2, he's still enjoyable to fight, but he may get underrated because of the amazing reputation that his Dark Souls 1 variant already has. And in case you were confused by the actual boss name, it's Dragon Slayer in Dark Souls 2, but it's widely accepted that this is just Ornstein 2.0. Going back to the regular path of the game, where you play through the last third, you'll have to fight the owl to progress. Miyazaki has heavily implied that the owl is his favorite boss in the game, and a lot of people agree with him. The owl will throw a variety of tricks at you, from anti-healing bombs to smoke to poison to random kunais. He also will counter all of your thrust attacks with a Makiri counter, and he'll just disappear in the Harada Estate variant as well as a couple more moves, because it's basically just an upgraded version of the boss. This is a pretty average boss fight for me, however, as I think some of these tricks can get a little annoying. The smoke and the poison are the 2 biggest ones, as the poison puts a gap in between you two, so you have to stand around waiting for him to come to you, and it's just a little boring. The same thing can be said with the smoke, and sometimes the deflect window for his follow-up attack can be pretty weird. Overall, he's a pretty fun boss, and I think giving him the tools that the player has access to was an interesting addition. The next level, the Ashina Depths and Mibu Village, used to be the level I hated the most out of the entire game, but I have since changed my mind, and I'll explain why. Usually the poison swamp levels are my least favorite level of the whole game, And while the fact that I generally don't like the concept does limit my enjoyment of the level, I think that most of my complaints with it are subjective and that it generally has a good overall design. The first area requires that you fight a reused boss to get to the actual area. At first, I didn't like this section because of the annoying enemies shooting at you, but if you have a good strategy and you use the poison field to your advantage, you can make short work of the gunman boss and move on to the headless ape. One thing I definitely do not think is a positive about this area is how 4 to 6 of the total bosses are seen in other parts of the game. It feels like they just kinda dumped some vague and unfinished concepts into the swamp level because they knew people were gonna hate this one anyways. The headless ape fight isn't too different from the normal ape fight until the second phase, when he spawns in a second ape. This boss has always felt like pure luck to me because the second ape has a relatively low health bar, and with all the camera issues it's just a matter of whether you were able to get all your prosthetics and a few extra hits off into the second monkey, or if you ran into the walls and got hit with all the camera issues. The next section is a little confusing and it's kind of a maze to the Mibu village. After defeating another drunkard and having an intense battle with a boss that can only be properly described as objectively the best and hardest boss in gaming history, the Miss Noble, to clear the smoke, you can finally proceed towards Mibu village. The enemies of Mibu village are kind of bland and annoying, but this area does have what is generally seen as one of the best mini-bosses in the game. Owen of the Water is both a deflection and endurance test. You won't really have any chances to attack her, so this basically acts as a skill cap blocker type thing, and it works really well in its role. The Corrupted Monk is similar, but I kinda wish that they just made an original boss for this area since we've already fought 5 bosses throughout one area, and all 4 were rehashes of older or future content. It does kinda work when you first play through the game though, as when you don't know that it's actually just a weaker version of the actual boss placed later in the game, you can take it more seriously and respect it as its own thing. If you don't cheese the Corrupted Monk by jumping on the branch and death blowing in the second phase using firecrackers for its last phase, it ends up being one of the hardest fights in the game with an extremely expansive moveset. Going past him, however, you will be taken to the Fountainhead Palace. You can take it up by this weird tree thing, and it doesn't really make any sense, but it kind of sets the tone for all the mystical encounters you're about to have. I already talked a little bit about the true Corrupted Monk, but I think this is truly one of the most underrated bosses in the game. Everything from the drop-in to the moveset, to the shadows, to the resurrection in the third phase is amazing. Before we go any further, I'd like to take a moment to point out that this is the most beautiful area in the game, and honestly the most beautiful area I've ever seen in any Souls game. That's purely subjective, but I think a lot of people would agree with me. Before we get back to the main point, I'd like to address 2 more things. The first is that throughout this video I've been heavily referencing the other games in the Souls series, and while I do think that Sekiro is the best in the series, excluding Bloodborne and Demon Souls since I haven't played them yet, I'm not trying to prove that objectively. In a video where I'm talking about how much I love this game, I'm going to inevitably mention the other games in the same series. If you think Dark Souls or Bloodborne or something is better, that's perfectly fine. I'm not trying to disprove your opinion. The second thing I wanted to address is a common criticism directed towards the bosses of this game. Oftentimes people will point out that a boss having 3 or 4 health bars simply isn't fair without elaborating. Bosses like the Demon of Hatred, True Corrupted Monk, the Eme Ishin and Genichiro Ishin fights are designed with the purpose, and simply saying too many health bars, not fair, game too hard is kind of disrespectful to the developers. It should also be taken into account that all these bosses that have more than 2 phases are, excluding Genichiro, endgame bosses, and technically you'll only be required to do 2 of these kind of fights throughout the entire game. Moving back into Fountainhead Palace, you are first greeted by enemies that will sap your life energy. These enemies are very prevalent throughout the first section of the Fountainhead Palace, and at first I thought this wasn't a good thing, but I have since changed my mind. My original reasoning was that such a grand place like this should have Grand Knight enemies like the Black Knights from Dark Souls 1, and that the gimmick wasn't really worth it. After replaying the game multiple times, it's become obvious to me that this area of the game does have those enemies in the Lightning Spear guys, and that only a small section of the overall area uses these life-sapping enemies. Moving ahead a little bit to the Giant Fish quest, I think this section of the game was brilliant. It's a simple and effective mini-story that pulls at your heartstrings in a way that reminds me of the Big Baby Man in Senpu Temple. There is a crying lady. She tells you to help her father and that he has been consumed by the fish. You find the father who has devoted his life to feeding the fish and talk to him. You build a small bond with the fish. You talk to the pot noble and he gives you a truly precious bait and tells you to feed it to the fish. You pretty much know that this will kill the fish that you've built a small bond with, but it will make everybody else involved happier. You have a decision: leave things how they are or discreetly kill the fish. If you choose the option where you kill the fish and go back to the guardian ape watering hole bonfire, you'll see the dead fish just lying there, and it sounds stupid when I say this out loud, but this simple story is one of my favorite things about Sekiro. The area leading up to the Divine Dragon is probably the best and most aesthetically pleasing section of the Fountainhead Palace. Every detail on and around that staircase is so well done from a visual and gameplay point of view. The Divine Dragon isn't really that difficult and it's kind of a gimmick boss, but it's another sign of progression and it truly does make you feel powerful. One thing the game does really well is making you actually feel like this super strong ninja that has all these special powers. The Divine Dragon highlights this in the best way. You are literally deflecting attacks and shooting lightning at a literal god dragon just to get its tears. Oftentimes the other Dark Souls games will tell you that you're fighting gods, but the atmosphere that these bosses actually create wouldn't make you think that they were gods. When I was told that I would be fighting the magic ice dragon, Seath the Scaleless, I thought it was going to be the most epic boss encounter ever, but it wasn't. I felt like any old dude with a sword could have defeated Seath, and honestly, I felt like I was any old dude with a sword. Show not tell is a phrase that is brought up often when discussing books and media that put a heavy focus on story, but I think it also applies to games. Don't just tell me that Gravelord Nito is supposed to be this all-powerful god, actually show me by making me feel like I'm on the level of a god when fighting him. After defeating the Divine Dragon and getting his tears, the Ashina Outskirts and Castle will both go into their final phases. Fighting through the Ashina Castle, you'll encounter a few bosses I've already mentioned. Another Lone Shadow Warrior, and an improved version of the 7 Ashina Spears mini-boss. The 7 Spears of Ashina boss re-encounter is actually very interesting. One of the general type bosses that you fought near the beginning of the game is standing right next to him. This is one of my favorite encounters in the game because you have so many options. You can deathblow the general, run away, get your first deathblow on the spearman. You can use Gotching Sugar to make yourself invisible, and then try to deathblow them both in quick succession using Red Smoke Ninjutsu, or you can use the Puppeteer Ninjutsu on the general if you really want to. This is another example of From Software having positive or good boss reuse. It reuses old assets, but it puts a nice little twist on that encounter to make it feel more engaging. Before you tackle the final boss, you can re-explore a compromised version of the Ashina Outskirts. This is one of the better levels in the game, as you can use the flamethrower's fire to hurt other enemies, and this is especially useful against the Chained Ogre. At the end of this level, you will encounter possibly the best boss in the game from both a story and gameplay perspective. When you first stumble across the Demon of Hatred, he will seem impossible. He has 3 faces, is extremely hard-hitting, and it could take you a while to figure out what you're really supposed to be doing against him. The Demon of Hatred is the only true Souls-like boss in the game, as none of its attacks can really be parried, and you'll have to rely on dodging, jumping, and grappling to avoid its attacks. It's an extremely fast-paced take on the regular Souls dodging boss formula, and I would actually love to play an entire game that mixes the mechanics between these games in an effective way. Despite the countering mechanics being gone, you still feel extremely powerful during the fight. You are taking on a literal demon that is the embodiment of hatred, and because of the atmosphere of the room and just the overall appearance of the boss, you feel like you're actually taking on a god once again. After you win, you'll be able to explore the rest of the area, and this is where an old lady nearby tells you that the Demon of Hatred was Shura. From some dialogue with the sculptor before and after the fight, it's fairly easy to deduce that the Demon of Hatred was actually him, and this is finally confirmed back at the Dilapidated Temple. The final boss of the game is probably the perfect Sekiro boss, and it perfectly encapsulates everything I love about the game. You re-enter the secret passage to find Genichiro on the other side. By this point, Genichiro is heavily weakened, but he has a couple new moves since he's acquired the Open Gate. After making quick work of this weakened Genichiro, he will use the Open Gate's powers to sacrifice himself and summon Ishin, the Sword Saint. Ishin, the Sword Saint, is essentially a manifestation of Ishin's younger self and his abilities being forced to fight you. This is one of the more complicated and easy to miss story beats, and a lot of people don't even know that the real Ishin was already dead. I've seen plenty of people on the internet saying that they thought Ishin was betraying you somehow and siding with Genichiro. Moving on to his moveset and the actual gameplay, it's important to note that his first phase is basically a lesser version of Ishin Ashina. This is another reason I'm heavily against the 4 phases too hard, too long, Sekiro bad argument, because it's very possible that you'll flawless both Genichiro, the first phase, and Ishin, the Sword Saint's first phase. Another thing to note about this boss fight is that Ishin's last phase is really easy if you just keep some space in between you two and deflect his lightning attacks. You can kill him in about 4 lightning reversals without taking any damage if you use this method. This pretty much just leaves his third phase as the true single phase of this boss fight. The third phase alone is probably about 85% of the boss fight, and it's what most people will get stuck on. In this phase, Ishin pulls out a spear, and wait a minute, is that a Glock? Yeah, Ishin gets a gun during this phase as well. His moveset is very complex, and he has some very fast attacks, but once you really understand and are able to put in the right inputs to counter his attacks, he isn't too difficult. After Ishin realizes he has been defeated, he kinda just rests there and accepts his defeat gracefully. It's a nice little moment, and even though Ishin is being controlled, it's a great send-off for his character. Depending on which items you did and didn't collect, and which dialogue options you chose, you could get 3 possible endings from here. The first one is called Immortal Severance. In my opinion, this is the true ending, as you don't really have anything extra to get besides staying loyal to Kuro and doing what he asks. After you sever the immortality by killing Kuro, you see a short little side cutscene where Sekiro is the sculptor. The lore reason behind this is that the immortality was the only thing keeping Sekiro from becoming Shura, and sculpting was the only thing keeping the sculptor from becoming Shura. Since Sekiro doesn't have that type of immortality anymore since Kuro's dead, he turns to the only other thing he has ever seen work and becomes the sculptor. The purification ending is the one where Sekiro uses a few extra items and sacrifices himself to end Kuro's immortality. This is my favorite ending as it kind of perfectly wraps everything up in a hopeful way. The last and final one, the return ending, is often referenced as the objective true ending of the game for some reason. I don't really know why people would say this, as it's extremely rare and hard to get. I think the main reason people are so quick to say this is the true ending is because it ends on a cliffhanger. After the Divine Child kinda absorbs Kuro, I don't really know, both your characters slowly stand up as she says that we're going to the land of the Divine Dragon. If there is a sequel, this will probably be considered the true ending, as this is the only ending where there's something still left to do. But until the next game is announced, we can't really say for certain which ending is the objective true one. If you watched this video all the way to the end, then thank you. I'm aiming to produce one gaming related video every week, so if you want to see more like this, then please consider subscribing. Even in this 30-minute video, or however long this ends up being, I feel like I still wasn't able to talk about everything when it comes to Sekiro, and I feel like I definitely had a lot to say about very specific little sections of the game in terms of scale and playtime, while I didn't have much to say for other, bigger areas of the game. I thought about listing everything I missed or didn't go into enough detail about down in this conclusion section, but there's too much and I don't really know where to start. Because of this, I'd love to talk about this game again, and if you like this video, then like the video to let me know you want to see more Sekiro content. If you have a specific question or just any comments about anything I said or didn't say in the video, please make sure to leave a comment. I will usually reply to all comments with an in-depth and thoughtful response. I have a few more videos planned, particularly ones about Hollow Knight, roguelikes, and the limitations of video game genres. If any of these topics interest you, then subscribe and hit the bell